Hi there. So today I'd like to talk a little bit more about natural resource economics. And actually we're going to kind of step back a little bit and put it in the context of natural resource management, which is about, how do we make these decisions about the natural resources we have around us? Those questions that we posed: how much timber should we harvest from the Daniel Boone National Forest? How much land should we be putting towards agriculture versus forest versus development? Those are natural resource management questions, and that's the context that is so important to understand when you're thinking about natural resource economic questions, which is basically when we use the models like I showed you glimpses of, whether it's fisheries or natural gas extraction. There are these models telling us how much we should be harvesting at any given time. It's so important to have that in the context of the natural resource management in which it's occurring. And to understand that context and kind of where things stand today, I want to provide a little bit of background about natural resource management in the US. And then our next video is going to turn to RAD, the decision-making model that is in a document that we have in our readings folder in the content section, something that came out of the National Park Service. So we'll talk about that in the next video. But this one, traditional natural resource management in the US, is it's largely done by government bureaucrats. And so right away I've got some of you bristling at the idea that government bureaucrats are making so many decisions about how natural resources are used in our country. And it's true. I mean, most of the land in the western part of the US is owned and managed by the federal government. There's also quite a bit of state-owned and managed land. So oil and gas extraction, timber harvest, cattle grazing, all of those things are done on federal lands in pretty big ways. A lot of mineral, a lot of mining stuff. So there's some old laws that go back to the homesteading days, basically saying if you find valuable deposits of minerals on federally owned land, you may have a right to be able to lease the land to be able to harvest those minerals. So that's kind of where we come from. We started as a country that was rich in natural resources, and there was for a long time this kind of open western frontier, and of course skirmishes with other countries and with Native Americans, and fights over those resources, but there were a lot of resources around. And it's still true compared to a lot of countries. We have a lot of natural resources. We have a lot of forests. We've got Alaska with a lot of gold and salmon and trees and oil. So we've always had bureaucrats involved in stamping the paperwork to allow someone to lease federal land to graze their cattle on. We've had scientists get involved starting in the early 20th century. We really started pivoting from simply a let's extract as much value from these natural resources as we can to let's take more of a scientific approach to it. Let's get some scientists involved, and let's kind of professionalize the bureaucrats who are running this stuff. And so the U.S. Forest Service, for example, started having much more professional decision-making sort of procedures that things would go through. They would have scientists work with the people who are otherwise overseeing leasing of timber rights or grazing rights or things like that, with the idea that we actually do want to balance. We don't want to just extract as much as we can because there's this dynamic aspect. There's also an element, especially if it's publicly owned land, that we're not doing this just to extract value from it. We're holding it in trust for the future, and we're probably wanting to allow multiple uses on the land. And so this turn toward more scientific decision making led to, in the 70s, there's this big environmental movement in the US. I mentioned, President Nixon signs all of these big environmental laws. He creates the EPA with an executive order, basically. Um, Not what you expect out of a Republican president these days. But in the 70s, this was bipartisan. Everyone could agree that protecting the environment was a prudent thing to do. You may have different motivations, but there was pretty much consensus that protecting the environment was an important priority for the country. And so we had the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, all these laws passed in. In that time, we also have a law that says our publicly owned lands should be available for multiple uses. And this has kind of evolved a little bit, but the core idea has been there since the 70s. And so basically, they now call it multiple use sustainable yield, MUSY, MUSY. Our national forest, our land owned by the Bureau of Land Management, this land, we want multiple things to be able to be done on it, with it. And when we are extracting things, we want it to be sustainable. We talked about max sustainable yield briefly. We see that here, multiple use sustainable yield. We don't want to be extracting as much as we can now. We want to be thinking about long term, how much should we be extracting each year or each time period to make this a sustainable sort of extractive process we're going through. So this mixed use sustainable yield management has been the dominant force for some decades now. And so we still have a lot of scientists involved in decision making with stuff. With multiple use, we're thinking about stuff like timber harvest, oil and gas extraction. We're also thinking about off-road vehicles, hunters, hikers, campers. We're thinking about wildlife habitat. We're thinking about waterways and protecting them, allowing public to have some level of access to them, to go fishing, to go boating. So this multiple use, that's kind of what's driving our natural resource management to this day. Now, I haven't mentioned in there the National Park Service. So the National Park Service has a lot of acreage as well, not as much as the Forest Service or the Bureau of Land Management. But we have some big national parks, right? Yellowstone and Yosemite, and some of these are iconic. Some of them are also, Yellowstone is a big park, a lot of acreage. Even in the eastern part of the country, we have some pretty good sized parks. We have a lot of small historic national parks in the east part of the country. But the Great Smoky Mountain National Park is pretty big acreage as well. And some places like Big Bend in Texas and Glacier, and there are some big parks around. So the National Park Service is and should be included in these discussions of natural resource management when it comes to public agencies involved. They've always been a little bit more, they've been explicitly more on the conservation side of things. So it's not explicitly multiple use sustainable yield. With the parks, it is more protecting these areas, but also allowing people to have access to them, right? And so that's the balance that national parks are trying to make. How do we allow people to access and enjoy and learn from these resources that we hold in trust for the American public, while protecting them for their inherent value, scientific value, future value? That's the big trade-off the national parks are making, much more than the trade-off among different activities. Should we allow ATVs to be going through this area or not? Should we lease this timber or not? With the national parks, it's more of a, that same access issue does come up. Whether we're talking about people walking through Mammoth Cave or having ATVs go through a section of forest, they're different issues, but they do share how much do we prioritize access over, say, conservation, pristine condition sort of things. But so that leads us to the RAD decision-making document that we'll talk about in the next video. It's important to have that context of, okay, this is coming from the national park. This might look different if it were coming from the Forest Service or if this were coming from Bureau of Land Management. It would certainly look different if it were coming from, the Georgia Pacific Paper Company, right? A private company that also owns a lot of acreage and has some similar goals, but not not the same goals. There's some overlap, but also some distinct areas. So we've talked a little bit about the history of natural resource management, how big a role public agencies play in that, and kind of where we've come to now with scientists involved in a lot of these decisions and multiple use, sustainable yield sort of ideas. And we'll see where we're going next. Thanks.